day to day, and this isn't her day. So it's that simple. Anybody, Ken, I'm going to ask you, if you will, to offer up the prayer. Ken, you got. It's good to have some good news. Anybody else? You got a new year ticking off? Unknowns. We had a really brilliant sermon on that just recently, talking about that. If you missed it, well. But then we want to talk about the new year and about what's going to happen and what may happen, and we certainly want to pray for this congregation, fruitfulness, as we call it. Anybody have anything they want to add? Dale, we're about ready to do the prayer. Do you have anything or anyone you would like to add to that list? I would like to add for all of us for the new year to pray for fruitful results in all the studies and interminglings we do with those that are lost. At the bottom of the list, at the end of the day, when all of the dust clears, you pick your own metaphor, the church is here to save the lost. And so it behooves us to look forward to 2025 being a year that we can do something for God. And you pray for fruitful results in that. So we pray that we, in all of the contacts that we do over 2025, will be positive and will yield good fruitful results. Anything else? If not, Ken, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Father, as we come to you this morning, together as your family, we ask that you clear our minds of the things of this world, concentrate, Father, on your word, your instructions, how we need to apply the things that we learned here today to our lives, especially when it comes to saving the lost, Father. We pray for the efforts that we've made here locally to reach out to our community. We pray that you bless them, that we will be able to find those people that you have, Father, that are seeking truth, seeking your word, seeking to know more about you, to be part of you. Lord, we pray this morning for Caleb Morris, who is in the ICU. We pray that you will be with the doctors and nurses, helping her that she will be able to recover. Others, Father, that we do not know about, but we pray that you will strengthen them and bring them back with us again. We thank you for the married couple that we have in this congregation, and we pray that they will be able to thrive in this congregation and help us in things that we do. We thank you for the preacher we have today. Pray that you be with him and strengthen him as he brings the word of God to us. And Lord, we most of all just ask you to help us remember each and every day who we are and what we're here for. Forgive us of our wrongs and help us, Father, to be more like Jesus each and every day. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you. We are in chapter 8. Chapter 8. Remember last week we finished up chapter 7, which, as we realized, was the final portions of the Sermon on the Mount, covered all of those details. And remember, whatever we covered and whatever the subject was, the bottom line is in verse 28, the result was that when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. For the first time in many of these people's lives, they heard someone speaking in the tone that said, "You have heard it said," and he would give a commandment that was the law of Moses. But I tell you, he said. Wow. Wow. And now when we hear somebody come along and do something like that, we're liable to step back and say, who do you think you are? But as that person talks, as we spend more time with them, What comes out of their mouth matters. And that tells us the knowledge and wisdom that comes from that person. Well, Jesus was giving wisdom they hadn't heard. He was expounding on ideas that they had been taught their whole lives and saying, wow, this man has authority. He is teaching with authority and knowledge. And that's what we all want to do, isn't it? Whenever we study with somebody, we don't want to come across as arrogant or know-it-alls, but we do want them to trust that we have a source of truth. And if we deliver that correctly, it has an effect on people's hearts. The word has power, and it does disrupt hearts, changes minds and attitudes. It has the ability to sink in, whereas we could sit all day long trying to convince them with our own words, and all we'd end up doing is argue. So Jesus showed his effectiveness in this sermon that lasted 2 chapters. Took 2 chapters to cover it. Now we're going to be looking at post-sermon. This is getting back to what Matthew was talking about in the beginning of his book, which is the deeds and chronicles of Jesus. So now he's given his speech. He's going to come on off the mountain, and he's going to take up his work again. And Matthew will cover in detail that. So what we're going to do, as we always do, is we're going to read through chapter 8. It's not a small chapter. It's not a huge one, but it isn't small by any means, 34 verses. But we're going to go through that and then break it up and start getting into the meat of the chapter. So, chapter 8, I'll read through it and then we will get started. It reads, and I'm reading from the New American Standard. And when he had come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and bowed down to him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded for a testimony to them. And when he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, entreating him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering great pain. And he said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who were following, truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. And I say to you that many shall come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast out into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, go your way, let it be done to you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very hour. Verse 14, and when Jesus had come to Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. And he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and waited on him. And when evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with the word and healed all who were ill, in order that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, he himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side. And a certain scribe came and said to him, teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, the foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And another of his disciples said to him, Lord, permit me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm in the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves, but he himself was asleep. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, save us, Lord, we are perishing. And he said to them, why are you timid, you men of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men marveled, saying, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" And when he had come to the other side, into the country of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so exceedingly violent that no one could pass by that road. And behold, they cried out, saying, "What do we have to do with you, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now there was at a distance from them a herd of many swine feeding. And the demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you are going to cast us out, send us into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Begone." And they came out and went into the swine, and behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. And the herdsmen ran away and went to the city and reported everything, including the incident of the demoniacs. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus. And when they saw him, they entreated him to depart from their region. Anybody have any comments or questions on that, what we just read? Very interesting. This whole thing is filled with interesting tidbits that we're going to talk about. I want everyone, when you read through the Bible, here's a good technique. It works for me. Each chapter that we read has subject matters. That's why it was divided into chapters. Neither here nor there on chapter and verses, but it makes it easy for us to reference that. But the ideas that the writer has may not follow those. You may be into chapter when the same idea from the previous chapter is being continued on. So it's a good idea to map out what the chapter is supposed to be telling. What's it covering? Historically, physically, we see each one of these parts to it, and to me, they're scenes. For instance, in chapter 8, we have in reality 6 scenes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The first one being the leper. There's a scene around that, and it's described, okay, sometimes in detail, sometimes not. Next part of it, the next scene we see is a centurion coming up to him and asking for his servant to be healed. But the next scene is he goes into Peter's house and sees his mother-in-law there lying there with a fever. He takes care of her. Then we have the section where they're going to be taking off, and you have people saying, "Well, I'll follow you anywhere." And he says, "Yeah, do you really want to do that? I don't even have a home. Are you ready for that?" And the other person said, "I'll be ready to go. Just let me go bury my father." But then they get into a boat, and it gets really rough. So rough that there's water coming into the boat, and the apostles or the disciples in the boat with them started fearing for their lives. And we have that whole scene. And then we have the demon possessed that he dealt with when he got out of the boat on the other side. So each one of those requires us to take a look at those things. They all have different ideas and purpose behind them, and we want to take a look at that. I also want to point out that with Matthew, as we can see, he's a detail-oriented writer. I mean, he'll even tell you something about the persons involved in what he's describing. Very detailed. All of the conversation looks like it's been recorded. But one thing he doesn't do is chronological sequences. You can't look at this as saying, well, first of all, he climbed up the mountain, and then somebody came up and needed to be cleansed. All of these things happen in detail, but we don't know the chronological sequence of them. In other words, I don't know how soon it was after he cleansed the leper that he dealt with the centurion. And Matthew doesn't tell us any of that. So it looks to us like he's just having one thing right after another happening, and that's not realistically the case. It is a chronicle, okay? Matthew, more than anybody else, reminds me of a reporter, a journalist writing an entire article reporting on something or some event that happened. When you read the way he writes his stuff, it's like he's telling you what happened because you weren't there. And so what we want to do is disseminate from that and put together what it is we're seeing. So we're going to go back through this now. The first thing, of course, that we see is the leper, the cleansing of the leper. When he come down out of the mountain, it says, great multitudes followed him. That's another fruit of his long sermon on that mountain. The multitudes wanted more, and they just kept following him. That's a sign that what he said stuck. And behold, the leper came to him and worshiped him. Now, in the New American Standard, it says he bowed down. But in the New King James, it says he worshiped him. Does it not? It says he worshiped him, saying, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now, this is an interesting request. The leper comes to him and asks him not to heal him, but to make him clean. And that word is translated into clean, hygiene, not filth, non-filth. So when he come down from the mountain and these great multitudes followed him, the miracles that Jesus is performing and the words that he's saying are attracting much attention. And his teaching ministry along with it, as we just saw. So Matthew demonstrates this by his mention of the great multitudes following him after coming down off of the mountain. Now, when we compare the events of this chapter with the record of Mark and Luke, we find that there's a different order of chronology. Now, some commentators make claims that Matthew arranged his material here according to topics and themes rather than chronological. I make no claims to that because I never spoke to Matthew. But I can disseminate from his writings what I think he's trying to tell us and how. That's our job, not to read into other things about it. Now, we remember an important foundational verse from Matthew's gospel. And remember, just a couple chapters before, chapter 5 and verse 7, Matthew tells us, now Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and disease among the people. Now, Matthew went on to tell us about the teaching ministry of Jesus. That's in Matthew 5:7, and the other was 4:23. And now he tells us more about the healing. This chapter deals more with the healing, the direct healing ministry of Jesus, and how his works confirms his words. Behold, a leper came and worshiped him, it says. In the ancient world, leprosy was a terrible and destructive disease, and still is in some parts of the world today. The ancient leper, though, had no hope of improvement. So this leper, came to Jesus with a great sense of need and desperation. And we have to assume that he was one of those in the crowd. I mean, he didn't just show up at the end of things. He approached him when Jesus came off the mountain. We must assume he heard at least part of this sermon. Now, leprosy, this is Barclay writing a little bit about leprosy in the ancient times. It says leprosy might begin with the loss of all sensation in some part of the body. The nerve trunks are affected. The muscles waste away. The tendons contract until the hands are like claws. There follows ulceration of the hands and feet. Then comes a progressive loss of fingers and toes until in the end, a whole hand or a whole foot may drop off. The duration of that kind of leprosy is anywhere from between 20 to 30 years for this to progress to this point. It is a kind of terrible progressive death in which a man dies by inches. According to Jewish law and customs, one had to keep 6 feet or 2 meters away from a leper. If the wind was blowing toward a person from a leper, they had to keep 150 feet or 45 meters away. The only thing more defiling than contact with a leper was contact with a dead body. Well, I don't know. It is a bacterial infection. As to how you contract it, in those days, they believed direct contact was the case. I'm not here as a medical doctor, just telling you how bad it was to have leprosy. in those days. It says in the Middle Ages, if a man became a leper, now this is the Middle Ages, the priest donned on his stole, took his crucifix, and brought the man into the church and read the burial service over him. For all human purposes, that man was a dead man. Think of that. Now, in our lifetime, we used to have a disease that came out that was a death sentence when it was given to you. It was called AIDS. And that was considered the plague. And if you had it, get away. Well, leprosy was one of these things in these days that for the ancient world was bad news. It says, for all these reasons, the condition of leprosy is a model of sin and its effects. Think of this. It's a contagious, debilitating disease that corrupts its victim and makes him essentially dead while alive. Isn't that what sin does? And it followed that almost universally, societies and religious people scorned lepers. Rabbis especially despised lepers and saw them as people under the special judgment of God, deserving no pity or mercy. Remember in the Gospels, Jesus is walking into a city and there is a beggar sitting by the gate asking for alms. And his apostles said to him, Master, which sin was committed to make this man a lame person? Was it him or his father? You see, the Jews believed if you had bad things happening in your life, that's God's curses upon you. You had to have done something wrong. So you got leprosy, God's cursing you. And nobody wanted anything to do with them. They didn't want to touch them because they didn't want to get it. They didn't want them around because they thought that they were filth. So these people were exiled out of the community. Nevertheless, this person who had it approached Jesus. That's our first sign right there. A man who had no hope approached Jesus after this sermon. And he came to Jesus by himself, and despite many discouragements, because you know that there were, he didn't want to go up and talk to this man. And he called him Lord. So he saw him as a high-level man. So he knew how terrible his problem was. He knew that other people gave up on him as having a hopeless condition. He had no one who would or could take him to Jesus. He had no previous example of Jesus healing a leper to give him hope. He had no promise that Jesus would heal him. He had no invitation from Jesus or his disciples. He must have felt ashamed and alone in the crowd. But he came, approached him, and worshiped him, gave him homage. Now, I said in the New American Standard, it says he bowed down to him. Now, the Greek word for this is proskanein, okay? And that word is never or hardly ever used for anything except to describe the worship of gods. When we see that word worship that's used here, it's almost always in the Greek, meaning man worshiping a god or a god figure. And it says here, how did this leper worship Jesus? He worshiped Jesus by coming to him, by honoring him as the one who could meet his otherwise impossible need. Think of that. He didn't have any questions. He didn't come and say, can I ask you a few questions first about your background? He didn't. He came up to him and asked. And it says he worshiped Jesus with his posture, bowing down and kneeling before Jesus. He worshiped Jesus with the word Lord, honoring him as master and God. He worshiped Jesus with his humility by not demanding, but leaving the request up to the will of Jesus. If you're willing, Master, if you're willing, Lord. He worshiped Jesus with his respect of the power of Jesus, saying that all that was necessary was the will of Jesus and he'd be healed. He didn't come up there with any ifs, ands, or buts. You do it if you're willing, and I'll be healed. He worshiped Jesus with his confidence that Jesus could make him more than healthy, but Jesus would make him clean. It's important to note that word there. You think this is a disease, and yet what he wanted was to be cleansed. That's the word used there. And when Jesus says, you are cleansed, it's the same word, past tense. So we're not talking about healing in the mind. We're talking about the fact that he wanted to be clean. Get this out of me. It's terrible. The leper rendered to Christ divine homage. And if Jesus had been merely a man, or a good man even, and nothing more, he would have refused that worship, just as John and Peter did later on when people were bowing down to them. Get up off your feet, don't worship me, I'm just a man. If Jesus didn't have the divine qualities of being Lord, he would have refused that right then. It says, Lord, if you are willing. The leper had no doubt whatsoever about the ability of Jesus to heal. His only question was if Jesus was willing to heal. He believed in the power of Jesus. Now, in 2 Kings 5:7, we have the story of Naaman. I don't expect you guys to read this. I didn't remember it either, but I caught it on a cross-reference and I went to it. It seems that the Syrian commander named Naaman was afflicted with leprosy. He came to Jehoram, the king of Israel, because he had heard there was a prophet in Israel whom God used to do miraculous things. When Naaman came to Jehoram, Jehoram knew that he had no power to help him. And he said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to heal him of his leprosy? That's 2 Kings 5:7 if you want to look that up yourself. Leprosy was so hopeless in the ancient world that healing a leper was compared to raising the dead. Yet this leper knew that all Jesus needed was to be willing. These are the telltale things that we need to take into when we read these things. They're not just words, there's meaning behind them. This leper came to him for a reason. We want to know why. Well, to be healed. But why did he come to Jesus? Because he believed that he could heal him. He might have seen that. You're right. But we have no record after this sermon. This is right after the sermon. The words say he came down off that mountain. The multitudes followed him. And a leper came up. He may have seen it. But what my heart tells me is that in that sermon, that long 2-chapter sermon that Jesus did on that mountaintop convinced this man that he was the man that could take care of his problem. And he had no doubts. He had no doubts. There's none of that. You don't see him coming up, well, I'm of two minds of this. No, he was sure and he asked politely. And Jesus dealt with it. It says, in addition, this is the first place we find in the Gospels where Jesus is called Lord. The title that was particularly meaningful in light of the fact that this word Lord is the word that's used to translate the word of God, Yahweh. And Matthew wrote his gospel to those who would be familiar with the Jewish context of this word. Jesus touched the leper in verses 3 and he's cleansed. He put out his hand and touched him saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed, it says. Now, it says here he put out his hand and touched him. This was a bold and compassionate touch from Jesus. The idea is that a leper kept his distance from Jesus, but he put out his hand and touched him. It was against the ceremonial law to touch a leper, which made the touch all the more meaningful to the afflicted man. Of course, as soon as Jesus touched him, he was no longer a leper. Now, it says he touched him. Now, we all know that Jesus did not have to touch the man to heal him. Didn't have to make a gesture, didn't have to do anything. Just a thought would have healed this man. But he healed the leper with a touch because that's what the leper needed. Remember, he says, cleanse me. And all of those looking on saw him touch him. That was meaningful as well. Jesus says, I am willing. His assurance that he was willing simply answered the man's question. confirming his mission here on earth. Remember John 17? At the end of that night in the upper room, when Jesus gives the prayer, and he talks about three things in that prayer. One of the things he says is, I'm thankful to you, Lord, for sending me and for me fulfilling my mission, for what you sent me. He's thanking God and telling him, I fulfilled everything you sent me for. He had a mission here. He had a purpose here. Along with healing the sick and tending to the poor, Jesus was showing signs of who he was. Now, it says immediately his leprosy was cleansed. The former leper's life was at that moment changed forever. We've talked about the ancient world and how they hated him. He went from being scourged and exiled, and nobody wanted to even come close to you, to now he's clean. He was not only healed, but as he requested, he was cleansed. Jesus had recently asked, and we remember back in chapter 7, he said, ask and it will be given to you. This was certainly true for the leper. And again, if he was there for that sermon and he heard that, could that have been the words that made him bold enough to come up there? Ask and it shall be given. Okay, I'm going to go and ask. This is the first individual healing described by Matthew. Again, back in chapter 4, we saw, Matthew tells us, that he went about the whole vicinity of Galilee, in and out of the cities, healing people. But now we have an individual described healing. Jesus, in verse 4, commands the healed man to give testimony of his healing to the priests only. Go and tell no one, he says. And as Jesus says to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to him. Just a little bit of background. In Leviticus, the 14th chapter, you will read about God's prescription for how to deal with lepers. And some of those lepers, through the priest or through God, using the priest, were healed. Not often, but sometimes they were. And there was a prescription given to the priest on what to do if God healed a leper. You had to have a ceremony for that. They also had to present themselves. Each person, if he was cured of this disease, had to present himself to the priest with the commandment from Moses, or the law of Moses, that since God did this for me, I'm going to give an offering. And then the priest gives this ceremony, all because he was healed. And that's what Jesus told him to do. Don't go and tell everybody else, but go to the priest and do your honorary duties. And see that you tell no one. Now, Jesus often commanded the people in the Gospels to be quiet about their particular healing or some miraculous work that he had done for them. And he did this because he wanted to keep down the excitement of the crowds until the proper time for his formal revelation to Israel. We read about that in prophecy of that time in Daniel, the 9th chapter. In addition, Jesus' miracles were not primarily calculated to make him famous or to be a celebrity, though they certainly did give testimony to his ministry, as we just now witnessed. The amount of people who left their homes, who left their cities and villages and filed out to this mountaintop to hear this man preach. More so, Jesus healed to meet the needs of specific individuals and to demonstrate the evident power of the Messiah in the setting of love and care for the personal needs of the humbled people. Now, we're not given all kinds of details in this, but Jesus always asked those who came to him for help, what is it you need? Do you believe that this can be done? There were certain things that Jesus needed to hear from the recipient before he could work his work. And we see that time and time again. Therefore, Jesus was more cautious about how the multitude saw him and why they followed him. That's an important part to this whole thing. Now, this motif of secrecy, in which we see all kinds of incidences where Jesus says some things, does some things and causes unwanted attention. And he always manages to slip out the back or get out of there. So this motif of secrecy, don't be telling anybody, it's better understood and reflected in it, that it's a real danger that Jesus could achieve unwanted popularity, merely being known as a wonder maker, or worse still, as a nationalistic liberator, and so to foster a serious misunderstanding of the true nature of his mission. And we saw that. He had to explain to them, I'm not this guy you think I am, okay? Mark tells us that the leper did not obey Jesus. And instead, he went out and began to proclaim it freely. That's Mark, the first chapter, 44 and verse 45. He says to show yourself to the priest. Now, Jesus commanded the man to give a testimony to the priest. That's part of it. You come to him and say, this is how I was healed. And what a testimony that must have been. The Mosaic law prescribed specific sacrifices to be conducted upon the healing of a leper. And when the man reported it to the priest, they no doubt had to perform ceremonies that were rarely, if ever, done. And you can read about that and prescriptions of that in Leviticus 14. Going to the priest would also bring the former leper back into society. And Jesus, healing the man, cleansed him. He wanted his life to be free of the detritus that had kept him isolated and hated by all the other people. So this is a good way in which, if you get the blessings of the priest, society welcomes you back. Jesus wanted this man to be cleansed, and he was. So now we move on to the next scene. And we're going to go through this, and probably this will be where we'll wrap it up for today. This is the one in which Jesus heals the Roman centurion servant. Now, in verse 5 and 6, he's approached by this Roman centurion. And when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, pleading with him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying at home, paralyzed, dreadfully tormented. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, and that's in Matthew 4:13 is when we're told that, that tells us that Jesus lived there. He came and dwelt in Capernaum. So the centurion comes to him. Obviously, he's a Gentile, right? He's a Roman centurion, not likely to be a Jewish person. He was an officer in the Roman army. Most every Jew under Roman occupation felt a reason to hate centurions. And yet he came to this Jewish teacher for help. Significantly, he came not for a selfish reason, but on behalf of his servant. He wasn't asking anything for himself. This was for his servant. And he pled with him, it says. He had an unusual attitude towards his slave. Under Roman law, a master had the right to kill his slave. And it was expected that he would do so if the slave became ill or injured to the point where he could no longer work. How about that? Now, just so you know, whenever the New Testament mentions centurions, and there's at least 7, depending on your which translation you have, there's at least 7 centurions that we read about, and each of them, ironically, is presented as a good and honorable man. So in pleading with him, it shows that the centurion did not make a casual request. Hey, can you help my servant out? I noticed you were up there preaching. You sound like a guy who could do something. Anything you do for my servant? It wasn't that. He came to him and pled with him. Now, pleading, there's a word for that. And that's what Matthew uses. This is an earnest request, is the translation of that. He seeks a cure, but does not prescribe to the Lord how or where he shall work it. In fact, he does not put his request into words, but pleads his case and lets the sorrow speak for itself. In 7 through 9, the centurion's understanding of Jesus' spiritual authority is seen. Because he says to him, Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only speak a word and my servant will be healed. For also am I a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he does, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. Jesus told him, I'll come and heal him. Did he put any kind of prescribes in that? Did he say, but I'll come, but I won't do this or that? No. He just said, I'll come and clean and heal him. He did not hesitate to go to this centurion's house. And we may wish that the centurion would have allowed him to do that, but it was completely against Jewish custom for a Jew to enter a Gentile's house. But it wasn't against God's law. Jesus wasn't hesitant about it. He was going. The centurion sensed this, though, and knew it when he said, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. He knew what the laws were. Most Jews believed that a Gentile home was not worthy of them. And the centurion supposed that a great rabbi and teacher like Jesus would consider his home unworthy. The centurion also showed great sensitivity to Jesus, and I think this is a good thought, in that he wanted to spare Jesus the awkward challenge of whether or not to enter a Gentile's house. I don't even want you to get a bad reputation for coming into my house. As well as the time and trouble of traveling all that way. He didn't know Jesus well enough to know that he would not feel awkward in any of these things. But his consideration of Jesus in this situation is impressive, isn't it? And his concern for both his servant and for Jesus. This centurion showed himself to be an others-centered person. He says, but only speak a word and my servant will be healed. The centurion fully understood that Jesus' healing power was not some sort of magic trick that required the magician's presence to be there. Instead, he knew that Jesus had true authority and could command things to be done and completed outside his immediate presence. That took incredible insight from a Roman soldier. So it's obviously not surprising when Jesus gives his response to that. He showed great faith in Jesus' word. He understood that Jesus could heal with a word just as easily as with a touch. For he says, I am also a man under authority. He understood that when he told people to come and go, they did it without question. So he assumed right there and then that Jesus had at least that much authority. But I find it interesting that a Roman soldier, under the authority and rule of Caesar, is seeing such authority and power in a Jew called Jesus Christ. Interesting times. And I think we're going to go ahead and leave it right there. We'll pick it up at verse 10 next week and plot on further. Anybody have anything else? Questions? I know I was going through a lot of historical stuff there. There's going to be some questions I'm going to be asking of you in this. But we really haven't come to anything that requires questioning. It's just detailed stuff. But in what we read today, anybody have any comments or questions? An armadillo. Well, whoever asked that question, there you go. Don't go out and handle an armadillo. Well, I ain't advocating to kill them. That's what you do. But you can move them, get them, go from here to there. Anybody else? If not, thank you for your time.